good evening, everyone from Lahore. I welcome you all to the second session of the webinar series titled Dialogues on Epistemic Justice. The series is a continued conversation on multiple issues of epistemic injustice. And this conversation originally began earlier this year at the American Sociological Association's annual meeting in a panel titled Doing Decolonial Theory in the North versus the South. Carolyn Shook, who originally proposed this panel, will brief you about it towards the end of today's session. Center for Critical Peace Studies at University of Management and Technology, Lahore is honored to host today's session. Our guest speaker today is Professor Erynn Casanova from University of Cincinnati, United States. Professor Casanova is Professor of Sociology and Director of Kunz Center for Social Research at University of Cincinnati. She is also Director of Research, Professional Development, and Academic Affairs at American Sociological Association. Her research interests include gender, race, ethnicity, work, family, the body, popular culture, globalization, development, Latin American societies, US Latinos, ethnography, and qualitative research methods. Professor Casanova will discuss her paper titled Global North versus Local South in Domestic Work Scholarship. Thank you for joining us today, Professor Erynn Casanova.
Thank you so much. And oh, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Professor Erynn, and thank you so much, Professor Alatas, for joining us. I'm pleased and honored to introduce him. He's our today's session discussant. Professor Alatas is a professor of sociology at National University of Singapore. He is one of the leading voices from the Global South who have effectively highlighted the issues of epistemic injustice and inequality. His work on Eurocentrism and academic dependency in social sciences remains at the center of contemporary decolonial discourses in the South as well as in the North. Professor Alatas' research areas include philosophy of social science, sociological theory, and political economy. His extensive contributions to the contemporary social sciences have been put into at least 4 categories, one of them being the revival of the overlooked Khaldunian sociological insights. His numerous works include Alternative Discourses in Asian Social Science, Responses to Eurocentrism, 2006, Ibn Khaldun, 2013, Applying Ibn Khaldun, The Recovery of a Lost Tradition in Sociology, and Sociological Theory Beyond the Canon, 2017. And I must mention here that Professor Alatas belongs to a family of renowned scholars who are much cherished here in Pakistan and also in other parts of the Global South for their highly significant contributions to the autonomous thinking in the South. His father, Professor Syed Hussain Alatas, and his uncle, Syed Naqib Atas, remain very popular names in Pakistani academia. Thank you so much, Professor Alatas, for joining us today. And may I request Professor Casanova to begin her presentation? If the audience have any questions, they may write their questions in the chat box during the conversation. Professor Casanova, it's over to you now.
All right, thank you very much. Good morning. Well, good morning for me, good afternoon and good evening, depending on where everyone is today. And thank you so much for being here and listening, and I really look forward to some dialogue a little bit later. So I'm going to talk about domestic work, which is essential to the maintenance of global capitalist structures. I think the pandemic has really underscored how much work is involved in cleaning and cooking and caring, and has raised the question of whether people and governments will finally support a feminist reorganization of domestic work with tasks that are usually done by women redistributed more fairly. I think that's an open question, leaning towards no. Today, I want to discuss the particularities of domestic work in a region that employs just under 1/3 of the world's domestic workers, which is Latin America. And despite the ubiquity of domestic work in Latin America and the rich and really innovative literature that has emerged from this context, the dominant paradigms for understanding this occupation continue to be those that are generated by scholars that are based in and investigating domestic work in the US, in Europe, and in East Asia, so the global north. And I'd love to have a discussion later about the limitations of the terms global north and global south. But before we get there, I'm going to say them a bunch of times. So that's just a heads up. And so domestic work, because it's different in Latin America than it is in other places, its analysis requires different theories and different discussions. However, the theories that have been devised to describe these Latin American cases are often seen as inferior to theories that are emerging from cases of domestic work in the global north, and so their impact is limited. And so we have this situation in which global north scholarship is global in two ways, both in its reach and in its presumed universality, whereas knowledge created in the global south can't occupy such a hegemonic and privileged position. So I'll start with a little story. Several years ago, a group of Latin American social scientists submitted a special issue on domestic work in the region to a journal based in the global north. And the editors of the journal liked the premise, but they told the scholars who wrote the articles that they needed to add more citations to research that was originally published in English. So their empirically rich and theoretically sophisticated analyses of Latin American domestic work were not enough. The authors felt pressured to name check scholars writing about more developed countries and to apply theories that were designed to explain those distant social realities. So the Latin American scholars pulled the submission and tried again at a different journal where the collection was eventually published. And so this anecdote, and we all have other examples that are similar, it really shows how intellectual domination and colonization impose obligations on scholars from the global south who are doing research on the global south. And these obligations only operate in one direction. So researchers of domestic employment in the US or Europe are never obligated to consult the substantial literature on this topic that's been produced in Latin America over the past 2 decades. Even those who can read the Latin American literature or can afford a research assistant with the language skills to help them read and synthesize it have no incentive to cite it. And so journal editors, regardless of their geographic location, we know they're embedded in capitalist logics of academic publishing and hierarchies of knowledge and language. They're not likely to demand that authors engage with the ideas in the global south literature, especially if those authors are writing about the global north. It just doesn't come up. And at the same time, we have global north research that's seen as universal rather than local, and authors being expected to refer to it regardless of where their study is located. So using the case of Latin America, I want to talk about 3 aspects of paid domestic work in these cases that differ from that in the global north. And I argue that these differences require theories and concepts that are specific and particular. Latin American contexts are not well described by the concepts and the assumptions that come from the global north and that have gained hegemonic status in this subfield. So I also want to have make a caveat here, which is I do recognize that transnational social movements of domestic workers and international NGOs emphasize the similarities among domestic workers in different parts of the world. And I do think that they do that with good reason and for strategic purposes. So I don't take issue with that. We're talking about kind of the academic understanding of this occupation. Local differences continue to matter, and without recognizing them, one-size-fits-all analyses, but also policy solutions might fall short of the goals of decent employment for domestic workers. So I'm dealing here specifically with Latin America, but I think some of the conditions I discussed may also exist in other parts of the global south. Some of you all might be able to speak to that when we get to the Q&A. So the differences I focus on demonstrate just a couple of reasons to resist pressures to apply global north theories uncritically to global south realities. Domestic work in Latin America differs from that in the global north along 3 dimensions. There's more than 3, but I'm going to talk about 3 today. And so the first one is informality. The second one is class, specifically intergenerational class domination. And the third one has to do with migration. So I'm going to start with informality. Although in most places in the world, domestic employment is arranged informally, that's pretty typical. The labor markets in which it's embedded have their own characteristics. By informal arrangements, I mean that most workers don't have a contract and that labor regulations regarding their work conditions are not routinely enforced. In Latin America, you have a situation in which domestic work is one informal job among many. So informal workers make up over half the paid workforce in the region, with some Latin American countries having a rate of informal employment as high as 80%. So while informal employment in the global north is certainly higher than official statistics indicate, those are not economies that are dominated by informal jobs in the way that you see in Latin American countries. So that brings up the question for me of how does it matter for domestic workers in Latin America that most other workers are also informally employed and that informal work is sort of the norm. These questions can only be answered through empirical investigation. I'm not going to get into that too much here, but just to point out that in research and theory based on global north cases, the assumption, often untested, is that economic informality or informal employment is rare, it's an aberration, it's limited to marginalized communities. But if you're looking at Latin American cases, you have to attend to the importance and the ubiquity of informal work. And that degree of informality can have consequences for workers' individual and collective resistance, their strategies, and it shapes the context in which they're making decisions about employment. So we have a situation in which domestic workers may share common concerns and interests with other informal and precarious workers, like farm laborers or street vendors, who are more numerous in Latin America than in places that domestic work tends to be studied in the global north. Another way that informality matters is in the enforcement of labor law. So informal employment is so common in Latin America, not only because the formal sector can't provide enough jobs, but also because governments don't have the capacity or the will to regulate or shut down informal work or to make it better for the workers. This is true even though Latin American labor laws in general are pretty protective of workers' rights. So how does it matter for domestic workers that lots of other workers are also laboring in exploitative and illegal conditions with little chance of intervention by the state? Global North research doesn't grapple with this issue as much as research that comes out of the Global South because informality is less prevalent. It's not seen as the default type of employment. So we do know that enforcement of labor protections for domestic workers is still lacking in the Global North, but the resources and the capability for enforcement do exist in a greater extent than in Latin America. So that's the first piece, informality. So let's talk a little bit about class, and specifically what I'm calling intergenerational class domination. So given the rapid economic changes in the global north, a situation where middle-class women entered paid work en masse, you have an influx of immigrant labor and concentration of wealth in urban centers. Most employers of domestic workers in the US, Europe, and even East Asia did not grow up with domestic workers in their homes. So in these locations, most domestic workers are migrants, transnational migrants, who didn't do this job or may have even had domestic workers themselves in their home countries. These employers and employees then are forging new employment relations as they go along, rather than enacting a traditional script that they're familiar with. And so most research in English focuses on the conflicts and the tensions that emerge in these historically novel kinds of employment relationships. The context of domestic employment in Latin America is different. Many employers were raised with, or we might even say raised by, domestic workers. And they're getting a lot of advice from family and friends about how to hire employees, how to relate to them, how to manage workers in their home. In many cases, neither the employer nor the domestic worker is the first generation of their family to enter this type of employment relation. So in my research on domestic workers in Ecuador, nearly a third of the domestic workers that we interviewed were daughters of domestic workers. So this demonstrates continuing rigid class hierarchies, right? You have a class of employers who were raised to command and workers who are seen as born to serve. In order to reproduce economic and social inequality, then domestic work relies on intimate exploitation in the private sphere. So it is a labor relation, but it's taking place in a private space, which makes it largely invisible when it comes to labor rights enforcement. But at the same time, you have lots of cultural representations of domestic work, which make it visible, right? And these representations are steeped in traditions that denigrate domestic workers and portray casual cruelty as unobjectionable and kind of the norm. So it makes sense for researchers of Latin American domestic work to rely on historical research about that region to contextualize their cases, rather than importing theories that frame widespread domestic work as something that's historically new or resurgent. So, I would argue that it matters that an employer learned how to manage domestic workers by watching her mother and grandmother, and that a domestic worker is following the footsteps of her mother and grandmother. Even employers and domestic workers that are entering their first domestic employment relation are still confronting a script that is historically prominent and that's transmitted directly from previous generations, whether they decide to change or depart from it, rather than co-writing a historically new script with their interactions in the home. So that's the second piece, which is about class and how class inequality is kind of perpetuated across generations. The third piece has to do with migration, the third aspect I want to talk about. So if you've looked at any of the literature on domestic work that's produced in and that focuses on the global north, you'll see that it often portrays only international migrant domestic workers, to the extent that a reader might come away with the idea that domestic workers are always migrants from other countries, right? Because if that's their only kind of exposure to this, this topic. The axis of exploitation in these studies is the racial and national origin difference between employer and employee. And in many cases, this difference also involves a linguistic breach. However, according to the International Labor Organization, a full 83% of domestic workers worldwide are not international migrants. And I'm going to say it again because you might think I got it backwards. Only 17% of domestic workers on the planet are international migrants, and yet they're the focus of nearly all the research on this topic that's published in English. And so we might ask why. Obviously, one answer is that international migrant workers predominate in domestic employment in the global north. In contrast, it's more likely that domestic workers in Latin America are internal migrants or increasingly non-migrant residents of the peripheries of urban centers who are undertaking long commutes to get to employers' homes every day. And so for this reason, most discussions of migration in Latin American research on domestic work have historically been about rural to urban migration. And we have a new crop of studies that's looking at urban transportation as a key element of working conditions, because you have sprawling cities in which workers are living really far from their employers. And that's a situation that we're seeing kind of in lots of different Latin American cities. I do want to say, yes, there are some well-known migration routes between Latin American countries, and that these circuits often involve domestic work. So you could think of the example of Nicaraguans in Costa Rica, Bolivians in Chile. But even this south-south migration is not the same as the south-north migration. That's the focus of global north studies of domestic work. So you have employers and migrant workers from nearby Latin American countries. Yes, they're separated by class and sometimes by race. They're separated by nationality and dialect, but they can usually communicate in Spanish, and they usually share at least some cultural understandings and practices. So for me, that's really different than a Latin American worker coming to the US, for example. Latin American immigration policies also tend to be more generous. Enforcement tends to be more lax than in the highly militarized immigration regime we have, for example, in the United States. And so the abundant research that we have on domestic work in Latin America helps us move beyond the assumptions about foreign domestic workers in the global north, which really identify migration status as the reason for workers' exploitation. The research on Latin America demonstrates that the social role of domestic worker is so other, so stigmatized and racialized, that internal migrants, urban poor women who are working in their own cities, and international migrants from other Latin American countries are all exploited and experience similar working conditions. So theories that privilege international migration as the main reason that domestic workers are exploited can't really explain this scenario of entrenched inequality in which international migrants are simply incorporated into social and economic hierarchies that already construct internal others as fit for domestic work. So that's the migration piece. So I'm going to wrap up here in a minute. And basically, I think you'll see that my argument is that it doesn't make sense and it's usually global north feminist academics, I'm going to call them out. It doesn't make sense for them to insist that studies of domestic work use a foreign theoretical lens. Concepts from the global north that have achieved hegemonic status throughout the world, such as care work, care chains, the second shift, these are ideas that should be interrogated rather than just blindly applied to any research site. And in addition, the literature on Latin American domestic work presents new questions, new topics that are really overlooked in a literature from the global north that's anchored in concepts of race and nation and migration. So in the Latin American research, we are encouraged to pay attention to contexts of informality, which I mentioned, class, especially that intergenerational transmission and maintenance of classed behavior, and to kind of bracket international migration and look at the other ways that domestic workers are oppressed as a group. Now, these approaches might have some generalizability. They might be useful for comparing domestic work across contexts, but because they come from the South, they're inevitably seen as locally specific in what I would call a global hierarchy of knowledges. And so we need to find ways to make sure that research published in languages that are subordinated to the global rule of English is available to a wider audience. I have some ideas about that, but if translation projects or multilingual research assistants can change the landscape of studies that are available to researchers, I think then we'll be able to learn whether outsiders' ignorance of Latin American contributions to knowledge about this topic, whether that ignorance has been unintentional or whether it reveals a deeper truth about whose knowledge counts. And so I'm providing this as an example, just something good for us to think with when we're thinking about this hierarchy of ideas and knowledge and whose ideas count. So I'm going to stop there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Erynn. I think most of us who are people from the global South, we can relate to your argument. And many of the things that you pointed out, these are the things we experience as well. Hello, Carolyn. Okay, so maybe I can invite Professor Alatas' comments, or Carolyn, would you like to go first and let us know about the, would you want to do it after Professor Alatas' comments? So Professor Alatas, let me invite your comments first, and then we can take Carolyn's. I'm going to give her a little time to let us know about this panel which she organized. So it's over to you, Professor Alatas.
Okay, all right, thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity. So I will be brief, just a few minutes. And I'd like to, I think I'll make about 6 points. You know, I think, first of all, that before I make those 6 points, when we look at this interaction between global North and global South studies, when we deal with the issue of Eurocentrism in social science knowledge production, when we deal with academic dependency and so on and so forth. Too often we speak at a very general level, and I think we need to speak at a more specific level, looking at specific areas in the social sciences, not disciplines, but within disciplines. And I think this is a good example of such work, looking at domestic work, because it helps us to gain some clarity on many of the contentious issues, and to understand how Eurocentrism works at the level of research, not in very broad general terms, but in more specific terms. So my comments are really along those lines. So as I said, 6 comments or 6 questions. The first one has to do with something that Erynn, you said at the beginning, that you say that there is that the theories that discuss that are based or that originate from the global North, there is a lack of fit. So my note here was to myself when I started reading your paper was, what exactly are the differences? But then, of course, later on you do discuss the differences. So let me come to that as we move along. But please let's keep in mind the kind of difference we're talking about. The kind of difference that I'm talking about are differences where a theory from the global North does not take into account certain facts. In other words, there is omission, yes, but the theory remains valid if those facts were taken into account, as opposed to the theory being invalid and creating distortion, loss of meaning, and which would imply that the theory would actually have to be discarded. So I think, when we do the critique of Eurocentric or Northern theory, we need to, to bring it down to that level. And then moving along, my second point, you talk about the anecdotal evidence that you referred to, that the journal had asked the Latin American scholars to include work done by scholars from the global north, and we all have such anecdotal evidence, and I think it's important that we actually do this kind of research, to bring this evidence together, not just for the sake of having a broad overview of the problem, and also to convey to people people who are concerned with the problem of north-south scholarship, and inequalities in knowledge production, not only to let them know that these are widespread problems, but also to use such studies as a basis of protest, because maybe we should be involved in some kind of academic protest. I mean, we study protests, we study social movements, we study labor movements, but we are less prone to be involved in protest as far as our own industry, if I may use the analogy, if I may use it, as I use it metaphorically, because my next point has to do exactly with the use of economic metaphors. But yes, as doing research on the so-called anecdotal evidence, to make it less anecdotal and more empirical, as a basis of protest. So my third comment, I think, is perhaps more substantial. The problem that you were talking about, domestic research on domestic workers, about northern researchers having little incentive to use local literature and so on and so forth. You discussed it towards the end of page 1. Now, I refer to that as the subject-object dichotomy, that northern scholars are the knowing subjects, and the peoples who are being studied, as well as the scholars in the global north, are objects. At most, the people in the global north, in the global south, are informants or research assistants, or they provide information, they provide studies on specific local phenomena. They're not involved in the larger process of theorizing. So they're objects in that sense. So it's what I call the subject-object dichotomy, and that corresponds to something you were saying about the universal particular dichotomy. Northern scholars provide universal knowledge, and the knowledge provided by from the south is of the particular. It's seen in that way. So that's just a comment, but also with regard to this point, you then in talking about this problem of northern scholars having no incentive to cite literature from the local literature, and I'm assuming you're saying that even if they do have access to Spanish or Portuguese language through research assistants and so on, yeah. You then go on to say that the journal editors, regardless of geographic location, are embedded in the capitalist logic of academic publishing and hierarchies of knowledge and language. Okay, now this is a good point, but I wanted to point out that the subject-object dichotomy, the universal-particular dichotomy, is a separate problem from the capitalist logic of academic publishing. Because the capitalist logic of academic publishing is also found in the global north itself, and does have its debilitating effect on scholarship. And in fact, academic publishing, academic capitalism is a recognized issue. It has been conceptualized. I think a few years ago, Bob Jessup, the leftist sociologist from the UK, published a few papers on the problem of academic capitalism, and several other people have published on the issue. So when we talk about academic capitalism, there is a parallel that is recognized between the larger economic phenomenon of capitalism and its manifestation, the manifestation of the capitalist logic in academia. Now, I find that very interesting because there are several theories of economy or political economy which are seen to have manifestations in the academic world. So you've got the political economic theory of imperialism, and you also have the recognition of intellectual imperialism. You have the economic theory of economic dependency, and you have the recognition of a parallel phenomenon in academia, academic dependency. And you have capitalism, and you have the recognition of a capitalist logic in academia. In other words, capitalism not only in the economic sphere, but in the academic sphere. And the third theory, and which is related to what you have been discussing here, in terms of the subject-object dichotomy, the fourth theory is the theory of economic extractivism, which I think we're all familiar with the idea of extractivism, of started in the colonial era, most notorious in the mining sector, where firms go in, extract and remove the extracted raw materials out of the colony, out of the country. So not only is there no economic benefit to the country in terms of technology transfer, benefits on downstream industries and so on, but there's actually harm in the sense that, for example, local communities are displaced, land is converted from agricultural use, converted away from agricultural use. Indigenous communities are often victims of extraction. But more recently, there's been the recognition of academic, intellectual, or cognitive, or epistemic extractivism, where which is exactly what you're saying here, that the scholar from the north goes in, has little relationship to the local scholarship, to the local literature. Where there is a relationship, he or she would organize local scholars in terms of informally, in terms of providing data, information, context. Sometimes formally, they would be organized in terms of participating in a book project where they would each write individual chapters, writing on specific issues on the particular. And the northern scholar, as the editor of the book, will be engaged in both the particular and the universal, and therefore become known as the theorizer, right? So again, here little value added to the local community of scholars, and their involvement in the whole process of knowledge making is marginal. So I was just thinking that as you expand this paper, it might be interesting to speak more, although it's not your intention, it's not the goal of your paper to speak about methodology, but it might be useful to, as you comment on these issues, to relate them to, especially to extractivism, especially since it's, I think the Latin Americans tend to talk more about extractivism than, I mean, not only economic extractivism, but also intellectual academic extractivism. They tend to talk more about it. There's more literature on it than elsewhere. So that was, I think my fourth point. My fifth point, and this relates to the issue of the particular versus the universal question. Would you argue that there are no general theories or concepts that apply to the study of domestic workers, or In other words, what is seen as universal, what is seen as universal, that is theories or concepts from the North, are actually particular. In other words, so there would be no universal concepts. Or are you arguing that concepts and theories that apply to the study of domestic work that emerge from the global South can be universal? Meaning that you see, the current status of social science knowledge production is that theories that, for example, that emerge from that originate from the so-called founding fathers of sociology, let's say, are universal theories, and they are applied to all parts of the world and all historical periods. But theories that emerge from, let's say, North America, Ibn Khaldun, for example, I work on Ibn Khaldun, they apply only to North America. They only apply to the Muslim world. Theories that emerge, from Japan, that are used to study Japanese society, only apply to Japan, and so on and so forth. This is the logic. Now, would you say that theories that emerge, the concepts, the ideas that you come across that emerge from a specific Latin American context can be universal? They can be applied to any part of the world, including the North? Because for me, that would be the ultimate, answer to the ultimate response to inequalities in knowledge production. I think this is my last point now, and this relates to what I started out with, that there is a need to explain how Northern theory doesn't or cannot accommodate the questions that are not asked. For example, under informality, you say the question of informality does not even come up in Northern scholarship. Okay, so the question is this. Okay, there is a gap. You've identified the gap. But global North research not grappling with that issue of informality, for example, is recognizing that is not the same thing as saying that the theories, global Northern theories, are irrelevant, right? In other words, I guess what I'm saying is, can global theory remain, can a specific theory that came from the global North on domestic work, can it remain intact and relevant while recognizing informality? Or does the recognition of informality actually put into question the whole basis of global Northern theory? So how fundamental is recognizing these gaps? How far does this recognition go in terms of the critique of Northern theory? Are we talking about modifying Northern theory, that Northern theory is sufficiently robust that it can accommodate these these criticisms, or does there have to be a radical critique and even rejection of these theories? Sort of, it sort of parallels the idea that modernization theory has certain weaknesses, and we can accommodate certain ideas and concepts from the global South, but modernization remains intact. But the theory remains intact. The basic assumptions of modernization still hold, as opposed to dependence, saying that the whole basis of modernization theory is wrong and we need to move to, for example, economic dependency theory, which has a completely different notion of the unit of analysis, the relationship between developed and underdeveloped regions, and so on and so forth. So I guess that question has to do with what is the implication of your critique of Northern theories of domestic work for those theories? Are you talking about modifying them, or are you talking about rejection, actually? Yes. And my last question, this is just a very short question. you say it makes no sense for global North feminist academics to insist that studies of domestic work in Latin America use a foreign theoretical lens. This, for me, is a great example of intellectual imperialism. But we need the evidence. Do you think, I mean, is it possible to actually cite such global North feminists? Are they actually insisting in no uncertain terms? Because that would, to me, be very interesting if they can be identified. I thoroughly enjoyed it, Professor Casanova. It was really interesting, and I think we, in our quest to give more weight to theories from the South, we need to critique Northern theories, not in general terms, but at the level of specific theories with regard to specific types of scholarship and subdisciplines in the different social sciences. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Alatas, for raising these very, very pertinent questions. Would you like to respond to this, Professor Erynn?
I will really briefly, and I also am really grateful for these points. I think this was a really generous and generative critique. So I'm going to have a lot to chew on after we get off the call, and we'll be thinking through these things. Just to respond to the very last question of whether we should name names about people who are putting these kinds of ideas out there, I just want to mention that, citation is political. We talk about the politics of citation. There's a reason why people at academic conferences in the US are wearing t-shirts that say cite Black women. If that was already happening, we wouldn't need the t-shirt. So there's a lot in that point. And I just want to respond to a couple of the other points. The subject-object dichotomy that you talk about is connected to your suggestion that we talk more about methods and methodology, right? So, in my book, I make use of participatory action research, which means that folks are involved in the design of the research and in the execution of the research project, which I think that's not the only way to maybe get around that or kind of have a new alternative, but that's one way that we can make that happen. So, I think that that's really important. This question, this super loaded question of are there any general concepts or theories, I think is really, really interesting. I think in the case of domestic work, I look at theories of social reproduction, which are actually really flexible and really useful. But in the global North, people stopped talking about social reproduction in domestic work, at least, in the 1970s. So that was a discussion that was very popular. The domestic labor debates, as they're known, within economics, kind of fizzled out. Whereas I think the issues that they raised about paid and unpaid domestic labor and what it's worth in a capitalist system, I think those are still really pertinent questions and important ones. And then the second part of your question, can concepts from the global South be universal and be generalizable? I think we're so far from a situation in which that's happening that it's hard to wrap my head around. What I do see in this topic, at least, is that the work that's coming out of Latin America is identifying, for me at least, some blind spots in the global North research, right? Informality is happening in the US and Europe. Nobody's calling it informality, right? So what would introducing that term and introducing that body of knowledge do to our understanding? The same thing with class, right? In domestic work scholarship that comes out of the US and Europe, the discussion is all about race and nationality, and class gets obscured. So the way that Latin American scholarship is insisting on the importance of class, which connects to the ideas of social reproduction that I mentioned earlier, I think that can actually illuminate things that are already happening in those sites of the kind of widely disseminated research, but are kind of hidden or because it doesn't fit within the paradigm of, care work and race and nation, they're kind of getting obscured. So I think that I don't know if that means that those are universal concepts, but there's certainly things that can complement the work that already exists in the global North. And I also saw a question in the chat that I wanted to talk about. Jagat mentioned the experience of the Global South as opposed to discourse and theory. And I love this question because I'm an ethnographer, so I'm working from experience as kind of the fundamental basis of my research. And I think that there's so much there as far as workers' experience, but also employers' experience. And you have a really interesting situation in Latin America in which most of the people who are doing research on domestic work are employers of domestic workers. And that's a really sticky, complicated position from which they're doing research, which makes it complicated in a way that researchers who are not implicated in domestic employment relationships are kind of at a remove from that. I think it's also why a lot of folks in Latin America don't do research on domestic work, because then they might have to interrogate their position as elites who employ domestic workers. And I think that's something we could talk about in general in the kind of global production of academic knowledge. Even when we have researchers from the Global South, those people are still elites, right? And so which subject positions are we getting information about, and what's the subject-object relationship within those countries when it's still elites who are doing the researching, like the research is still studying down. So I think there's some really interesting questions there that we could touch on. And I think, let's see this question from Farid. Right, so Farid is saying that this is not going away anytime soon. And I would agree with that, but it looks like they want Professor Alatas to respond to that as well. So those are just the points that come up for me, you know, in what Professor Alatas said and in the comments in the chat. So hopefully there was something useful in there.
Can I quickly just say a couple of things?
Yeah.
So point about methodology, about subject-object dichotomy and methodology, you mentioned participatory action research. You also mentioned in your paper that the domestic workers in Latin America tended to be, unlike the ones in North America, for example, in the North, they tended to be highly educated with degrees, with university degrees and so on and so forth. Is that, do I remember correctly?
I was talking about migrants to the global North who experienced downward mobility and become domestic workers when they weren't back home.
Right, that's right. Because, right. No, I was just wondering, what has been done in some cases, especially among anthropologists, is, you know, going beyond participatory action research, where the so-called respondents, the so-called, you know, subjects are actually involved in the research process, in writing, for example. Mm-hmm. And of course, this depends on the extent to which the people that you work with have some level of education. But you know, I know of cases, indigenous peoples, for example, an anthropologist works with indigenous people and works on land displacement. But instead of writing the book up himself, he has each of them involved in a chapter, and he works with them. And he finds members of the community who are, there may be members of the community of that particular indigenous community who is a journalist, or who has, or who have levels of education that make it possible for them to be involved in the writing. So going beyond just providing information. So I'm just wondering whether that has been done with domestic workers, whether that's possible to do with domestic workers, and whether that kind of writing would actually go some way towards their political cause, and would it have some impact on the way they organize and the impact of their organizing. So that was one. The other one was with regard to Farid Awan's question. Yeah, of course, competition will go on forever, but maybe we should forget about the competition. I'm more concerned with circulation of ideas within the Global South, that we should know about each other's work. And as far as the North is concerned, we should continue to to get ideas where the ideas are important and relevant. And also there is, the South within the North, right? There is the South within the global North that we need to engage with. I mean, we learned about many things, including epistemic extractivism from, I think the person who's maybe among the first to talk about it was this Leanne Simpson, who comes from an indigenous community in Canada. So we have a lot to learn from them, and vice versa. So forget about the competition. We are not looking for recognition. We just want good ideas, and we want to have some camaraderie with people anywhere in the world who have good ideas.
And I'm going to jump in just for a second. The things that are most exciting to me about the scholarship that's being done on domestic work in Latin America is the places that academics and activists are coming together and talking kind of across those lines. This is something that's kind of always been there in the research on this topic. There was a really influential book called Muchachas No More, which came out in the late 90s. And there were chapters written by academics, and there were chapters written by activists from different Latin American countries. And so we're talking about, within this topic, that's kind of a tradition, at least in the global South. And I think that related to that, there's two things. So I talked about the privileging of English, but we could also think about the privileging of the written word and how that can exclude people with low literacy levels who have a lot of knowledge, right? A lot of kind of lay theories of their social realities that are worth us looking into. And so can we think about oral presentations of knowledge in Latin America, the role of testimonio as a way of understanding the world and creating theory? We see academics and activists writing together, but what if we question writing as the main product of collaborations around creating knowledge? So, yeah. And I'm going to look at the chat.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Casanova, Professor Alatas. Through this was, I think, a very useful interaction. And through such interactions, we want to really highlight the issues. I think many of the issues which we discussed today, these are the things we want to highlight. So it has been very fruitful. Thank you so much. Carolyn, I would like to now give you a little time. If you could please explain us the background of this discussion and about your ASA panel.
Thank you so much, Fatima, for organizing this wonderful series and everything. Yeah, I'm still struggling with my PhD, and I'm not fully 100% here at the moment, but yes. So yeah, of course, as to how do we deal with this Eurocentrism, of course, there's this one strategy of just delinking and focusing on autonomous regional social sciences, like Professor Syed Farid Alatas and his father, Professor Syed Alatas, have also suggested. For me personally, as a white person, of course, if people want to do this, I totally support it, but I still think I should do something more kind of as a protest or as an intervention, since I'm also, yeah, the weird situation with me is I'm a white PhD student at a community college in Hong Kong or something like that. So I'm in a really weird in-between position and not belonging to any of these worlds, but having partial access to some of them. So, but yeah, I thought one thing I can do, because white privilege also allows me to be taken serious in some of these venues, or access or some sort of trust, as I noticed at these conferences, that I just try to organize sessions or maybe try to organize special issues or things like that. So I've been trying to organize decolonial sessions at ASA for 2 years, and I'm hopefully also organizing a small one this year if everything goes as planned. And the idea is just to make the problem visible to global Northern scholars and to address it on a more theoretical issue and say, okay, this is a problem, this is a sort of discrimination, especially, I mean, the main problem is actually journals. conferences like ASA, ISA, European Sociological Association, or British, these are also part of the problem because they produce knowledge that influences to a large extent a lot of global sociologies, but they see themselves as nation state or regional conferences that have no obligation whatsoever to outsiders or foreigners. And they, a lot of the time, they do not consider, do we need people from the global south to take part here? How can they access our conferences? What would it take? How are we excluding them? Are visa regulations excluding them? Are the fees excluding them? So there's this whole really political economy where people get excluded that actually would really have something very important to say there. And that's part of this political economy process that also Professor Syed, Syed Farid Alatas and Syed Hussein Alatas have also really described in detail, that Pauline Hotonji has described in detail already, that there's a structural process of exclusion that's happening here, right? So I don't want to talk too much now, but yeah, so because journals, the author has such a weak power position. Actually, journals are the biggest problem, but it's really difficult to get to do something about it, maybe with special issues, but I'm still almost still too junior to try to tackle that. I've been trying to tackle that one time already, but I'm focusing on the conferences so far to just give a platform and sensitize people that this is a discrimination of non-Western scholarship, and of course, most of the time, non-white scholarship that actually has so much to offer, and that we do need to have a full and complete social theory, and that is just being excluded. Okay, I think I'll stop here, but yeah, if any more questions arise.
Thank you so much, thank you, Carolyn. Yes, I think it would be great if we could actually make some difference through these dialogues and through these discussions. We can actually make some difference in the way things are going on for quite some time. Do we have any questions? Yes, please, Anne, go ahead.
Good afternoon, everybody. Morning, evening. I just want to sort of hook on to what Caroline just said. I've been saying this before also. I agree that one of the really big problems is the journals. There's often quite a large sort of acceptance of difference at the conferences, but then nothing more happens. So that's why I'm suggesting, to create our own journal, or actually several different journals from the South, which is a cooperative sort of thing with colleagues that are interested in the same subjects. But I'll maybe also then invite Caroline to cooperate with me, and the two of us trying to approach these journals that we think would be interesting for us to publish in, to suggest a special issue, for instance. So, Caroline, I have to leave a bit early today because I have social engagements and stuff, but please send me a mail if you're interested in doing that, because maybe you and I could start doing that within our own, because this is sort of our own white community, to start lifting it into the journals through our position space-wise in this context. But my other reflection, because I think that the discussion that we are listening into today is really, really important. But I also think that perhaps it might be an idea to actually look a bit closer at least one initiative that I think might be very helpful. And it's getting a bit old at the moment. It's getting older and older. It's from 2001 officially. It's called the Dialogue Among Civilizations Initiative. And emanates from Iran, but that does have intellectual dialogue as a centerpiece. of what is important, what needs to happen. And I think it might be interesting to actually look a bit closer at that initiative from the different vantage points that it gives us, to look at how you can sort of start a conversation. I think I see this all the time, that okay, so Iran is extremely excluded in the north, but it is actually also excluded in the south. And I think that is a huge problem. And in particular, it's a huge problem for the south, because Iran has produced intellectuals and politicians who are fundamentally decolonial or acolonial, non-colonial in their way of thinking. And they have this, there's a decolonization, decolonial epistemics is part even of high school education. So I think perhaps we need to look a bit more into what's going on in that particular region. And I think that would be interesting also for you, Fatima, to sort of look a bit more into that. Now, I'm particularly interested in it, and I do research on that particular initiative, but I think it would be helpful maybe to look closer to that and that way of thinking about things that we find in that initiative, actually. But yeah, so that was my comments only. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That's wonderful. And I totally agree about what you're saying about Iranian scholarship. I only today came across a few pieces which were quite amazing, and they were from Iran. So I just remember you were telling me that they're very far ahead of in these debates. So, and yes, in terms of doing something practical and really trying to make a change, we are going to stay in touch, and let's talk about a journal as well. Let's talk about other things as well. So we are going to be in constant conversation, and we'll try that we can do something actually to bring some change as well. Do we have more comments and questions?
Yeah, I wanted to also just add to what Anne was saying about Iran. Yeah, I myself have contact with academics in Iran. And more recently, there's been a book series published by Brill and edited by Dustin Bird in the US and Syed Javad Miri from the Institute of, I forget the name of the Institute, Cultural Studies and Social Sciences and Cultural Studies in Tehran. And that's a decolonial, it's a kind of decolonial series. They've had volumes on Frantz Fanon, on Malcolm X, on Ali Shariati, and in fact they're coming out with a volume on my father, which should be out next year. So that's an example of the kind of work that is coming out of Iran. I think Iran gets bad press because of there are indeed serious problems with Iran. The nature of the regime. It can be a very brutal regime. There are problems in terms of academic freedom, but it's only those aspects that get the attention of the media. But there is a very lively intellectual atmosphere in Iran, despite the problems. The revolution was not just a political economic revolution. It was also epistemic in the sense that they were critical of many of the problems that we are talking about today. So I think we should have more engagement with them. But it's not to put Iran center stage. There are many things going on in local academic communities around the South, which we don't know about and we have no contact with. I mean, we really need to forge those contacts, however that can be done, through these webinar series or through a journal that Anne was talking about, starting. Perhaps, we should worry less about the competition with the North and start forging these kinds of ties.
Okay, yes, thank you. We totally agree. Okay, if you have any more comments or questions, if someone has a question, they can go ahead. Yes, please. If someone has a question, you can unmute yourself and please go ahead. All right, then I think we can call it a day. Yes.
No, let me ask you first. Am I right to say that when we started this group, it came about as a result of two Facebook groups? I mean, I know there was the ASA conference, but were there not? I think maybe Caroline remembers the history of it. There were two Facebook groups or pages. Am I not right?
Yes.
So my question
yes,
is,
Karen. Yes.
Caroline, please.
Sorry, there's the series Facebook group and also mine, and then I've been organizing these sessions for 2 years now. Yeah. So.
Oh, I see. You have been organizing for 2 years, even before the rest of us, before some of us came on board.
But it's just, I'm just randomly organizing some sessions at this kind of conference, yeah. So it's just a one-person project.
Yes. No, I was thinking, have we publicized this to other groups, and made these discussions known to other groups, and also made it known to people who may potentially want to make their presentations and receive comments, or is it only publicized to these two Facebook groups?
We have advertised for the talk outside, but we have, like in other groups, but we haven't specifically invited presentations or invited like participation. So yeah, that's definitely a great idea to do that.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, we do intend to extend it further. I'm advertising it here on my forum, on the Center's forum, and to the people who are interested. And we do want to take on board more further. Right now, we do have 2 or 3 presentations in line. So once that is done, we are going to invite more scholars as well. But I totally agree. Yes, we have to expand this network and advertise further. And making connections is very, very important. So we should do that, definitely. So those of you who are here in this session today, if you know people who are interested, this is an open forum for everyone who is interested. So everyone can get on board, and they're welcome on this forum.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
I think
yes, please.
No, I'm just saying we just need to make it clear that the papers should be dealing with these methodological and theoretical issues, and not and with reference to specific research projects, rather than very general critiques of Eurocentrism and Orientalism and so on. Yeah, that's right.
Yes, right. Carolyn, you have to say something?
Sorry, how are we on time? Do we still have time?
We still have time, yes.
Okay. So one thing, because Professor Alatas was asking earlier, are there general theories and which location do they come from? If I may, I can really quickly talk about my PhD project. So I'm basically looking at migration from a Hong Kong venue, and what I'm getting, the view I'm getting from Northern migration theories is really that they're extreme cases. They're investigating the most privileged receiving society, so not even the top half or top 30, but more like the top 20 or top 10. So they really talk about extreme cases. But Hong Kong, of course, is also a global city, so it's also a specific case. But comparing these two cases, at least kind of throws into the relief the dimensions we're really talking about, and says, okay, these things are variables, when in the theories in North would think these are constants. But then, of course, one would need to go into the semi-periphery and periphery. And then from what I see, then one could get an outline of maybe a global theory of migration. But of course, there are always local specificities where such a theory would not apply. So it would more be like Marxism than like a super nuanced mid-range theory that can really grasp a local reality. But yeah, just very briefly. But the other question, if Erynn still has a bit of time, I would really be interested in the idea of a pre-conference. And I would just like to very briefly ask, how do preferences work? Where do people apply for this? What is the deadline? Just these very, just because actually I really lack information. I do like the contacts, but I also do like the information, and that's the two reasons why I haven't been more successfully organizing things. And also very briefly, how do the regular sessions work? And it might be that regular sessions are just impossible to organize at the moment, then that can't be helped, but just how does it work? Thank you so much.
I am looking for the link to the pre-conference submissions. Okay, I'm going to put it in the chat. Yeah, so I mean, the issue now is that we're going back to in-person conferences, right? So that in itself limits who can participate, right? If you can't get to Los Angeles in August, then you can't participate in the in-person conference, which is why I really like these online dialogues that we're doing, because anybody can log on from anywhere, right, and take part. I dropped in the chat the call for proposals for pre-conferences. And I think a pre-conference could be really interesting because it's like a full day of sessions that are dedicated just to this, and you'll have the same people, you know, kind of following the sessions throughout the day. But again, I think the fact that it's in person really limits the, you know, who can participate. But I think, you know, as opposed to doing a session here, a session there, having a pre-conference could be cool because there's like a through line, you know, across the sessions and the presentations. So, you know, I think we should be creative about where we can inject these kinds of discussions and conversations. And I actually think that the forum that we are creating here has a place, especially as we can start to spread the word, because we understand that conferences are by definition exclusionary in lots of ways, you know, to folks who don't have the economic means to participate. And we had a sort of a momentary blip, you know, like a pause on that with all the virtual conferences. And I feel like now we're moving back to in-person. And so there was a kind of an opening that now might be closing. And so, you know, it requires us to get creative and kind of think around those restrictions and constraints.
Yeah, I think that even with, you know, us going back to on-site conferences, in many cases, I think there would be a hybrid mode that would be in place. So for many conferences, I expect that, you know, there would be simultaneously online. And the other thing is, even if that doesn't happen, in cases where that doesn't happen, you know, contact like this via Zoom and other means should continue. We should definitely make sure to keep these contacts alive. Even if we don't meet each other on site, we can at least continue this. But Erynn, can I push you on one other matter? I wasn't sure I understood your answer to the question about global North feminist academics insisting that studies of domestic work use foreign lens. You talked about the politics of citation. Okay, I understand that. But were you saying that as a justification for not citing them, or is there a political reason for not citing them, or what did you mean?
No, I was saying that to me to say that the global North feminists should be more expansive in who they're citing. and it's connected to Caroline's point about the journals and the gatekeepers, right? So who's getting the papers to review and what kinds of comments are they giving? And it's not individual people; it's kind of a system that's set up to privilege certain references over others.
Yes, sure. No, I agree with that. That they should be more global in the way they cite. But I was more interested in the feminist academics you're talking about, because I think citing them, those who are who are insisting, right, citing the works, if in fact they are actually doing this, insisting in their specific works, their writings, their talks, and so on, because this is evidence for kind of academic imperialism. So they need to be cited, so that they can be referred to specifically as those who insist.
Yeah, and I think more common than them saying, here's what to cite, is just looking at the practice of who's being cited, right? And it's like a little club where everybody cites each other. And if you're outside the club, it's like you don't exist, right? So, and I think we can see that in lots of subfields and lots of topics, where the absence of something is evidence of something, if that makes sense. Yeah.
So, some of the evidence comes from journal article reviews. The example you referred to at the beginning of your paper, I myself have an example. Years and years ago, when I was a graduate student, I submitted something to a journal, and they insisted that one of the weaknesses they cited in my paper was that I wasn't using a concept. I remember the concept was social formation. Social formation was very much in vogue in Marxist, neo-Marxist sociology those days. So they criticized me for not using social formation. And I couldn't understand how my including the term or the concept social formation would have added any value to my, any substantive value to my paper. So I think there's a lot of, data, evidence that comes from review reports. But we don't consider we don't keep these things, and they're not stored anywhere in a database. There are no archives for it, partly because people are very often ashamed of the reviews that they get, right? So until they become acceptable as forms of evidence, it would be difficult to go beyond the anecdotal, I think. Yeah. But maybe we should start making public our reports. The reports that we receive as submitters. Yeah.
I love this idea. Even just sharing excerpts of reviews that show the exclusion and the discrimination that's happening, behind the scenes. I think that would be fascinating.
Right.
Yes, I think this is a lovely idea as well, and something I think we are really. There will be things and patterns that we can see in this kind of data. And like Professor Alatas was saying, all of us have stories to tell, the kind of reviews we've been getting. And so it's going to be very interesting. Maybe we can have, those of us who are willing to share this, we can have a study on this as well. That could be very useful data to explore. And which gives us something specific on whatever we are talking about. It's going to give us some specific data on that.
Okay. And just the last, sorry Fatima, I'm taking your time. Just the last point, because I thought it's very funny about journals. When my book, the book that I co-authored with Vinita Sinha, Sociological Theory Beyond the Canon, it's all about the critique and the response to Eurocentric and androcentric social science, sociology. So when I contacted some journals to ask if they would be interested to review the book, I contacted a European journal which does work on theory, and their reply, I was amazed with the reply. They said that we deal with European theory, and I thought, yes, and this book is about Eurocentrism. How European can that be? But I think they didn't get it. They thought the book is about us in the third world, in the South, talking about theory, and they're interested in European theory, just in European theory. So that's also some kind of evidence. I've kept the emails.
Yes, we actually do get a lot of evidence when we are actually doing all these things. I remember whenever you read anything coming from the North, there's so many references there, and you have to look for what is this event, what is this person. You have to look for the background. But once in your own article, I once gave a reference of Malala Yousafzai, and they said that who is she? Just write it down in the footnote, or whatever event or which is very well known. Generally, we think it's very well known, but they asked you to give it in the footnote, give the explanation. What does it mean? What is this event, or what is this person? So, but when we are reading their stuff, we have to do a lot of background search to understand what they're talking about. So these dynamics are there, I think, and they can serve as wonderful data, as evidence of what we are saying. So we should do a bit of these collections. That would be great. Do we have more comments from the audience or any questions? Yeah, Carolyn, you want to say something?
Yeah, just very quickly. Yeah, I totally think what Professor Alatas says is correct. There is a problem that these Northern scholars imagine their audiences as Northern. And this problem really is pervasive through journals, through conferences, through review process, through graduate training. Even if they have Southern graduate students, they think, oh, but we're training them for Northern labor market, so they shouldn't do stuff that's useful for people in their home country. They should be competitive at Northern labor market. So, and at the same time, they kind of know they're influencing the whole world, and they know that they have power over global sociology, global social sciences, but still they're stuck in this world. No, what we have to be relevant for the Northern audiences. So yeah, maybe that's a key problem, I think, but I don't know how to deal with it.
One of the concepts I found very interesting when analyzing these kind of things was white ignorance, which says intentional ignorance. So that was pretty much useful. Okay, do we have more comments or suggestions, or if someone wants to ask a question, they can go ahead. Or otherwise, we can call it a day. It has been a very interesting, very engaging discussion. Thank you so much, Professor Erynn, Casanova, Professor Alatas. Thank you so much for being there. Thank you for your time, everyone. So, and we are going to announce this next session very soon. And we hope that we can sustain this dialogue. And through this, we can bring some change as well. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good weekend.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.